friends are since.
Today I decided to forge ahead with my Commodore 64 synthesizer project, and the next part of that build was to install two SID chips. If you're not familiar with the Commodore 64 or the SID chip, essentially that is the bit that all the electronic musicians are interested in. It is the coveted audio portion of the Commodore 64 that gives it its distinctive sound. Now, the original Commodore 64 was not designed to have two SID chips in there, and installing two at one time is not just some kind of, exuberant thing to do. There is a specific logic behind that, and that is that there were two main models of the SID chip produced. There were various revisions of each of these, but the two main ones were the 6581 chip, which was the original, and then the 8580, which came later. There are various technical differences between these two chips, and the main thing to bear in mind is that the 8580 chip was the kind of upgraded or fixed version of the SID, and that was because there were a bunch of imperfections with the original SID design that they were trying to address with the second 8580 model. Now, of course, when you start to fix imperfections in something that's already been used for a long time, you start to end up with these unintended consequences, because artists and musicians and composers who were writing music for the Commodore 64 on the old SID chip were taking advantage of these imperfections and glitches and using them to kind of artistic effect. So if you install an 8580 SID chip into your Commodore 64, sometimes the games don't sound the way you might expect them to, and that's because the SID chip has got a wee bit of a different design. If you look online, you'll see a whole host of people with heated debates talking about their favourite SID chip and their preference and what the various sound qualities are of each one, and that's not something I'm going to get too involved in this video. But the main kind of differences to be aware of are that the 8580 sounds a lot cleaner and sharper, whereas the older 6581 chip, to me at least, sounds a wee bit more muffled, but it sounds a bit thicker. It's got a bit more of a grit to it. And so part of the reason that you might want to install both at once is so that you can switch between those two characters or have them both played at once, which when you're making music with the chip itself is particularly interesting, because then it gives you a whole other dimension or layer of sound that you wouldn't get normally with just the one SID chip in there. Now, people have been doing modifications like this to the Commodore 64 for a long time, and there's various different methods of installing a second SID, but some of them can be quite complicated in terms of adding specific capacitors and soldering things on to different places. But that is why I like this particular SIDFX expansion, because it's really just a kit that you can slot in place and you don't have to do any soldering at all, so it's much more straightforward in theory. Now, I'm not going to bore you with my whole build log or anything like that. I'll just kind of talk through the main part of the installation whilst you see it working through it in the background. But essentially, you take the top chassis off of the Commodore 64, you carefully take out your existing SID chip, you then place your two SID chips onto the wee daughter board thing that comes with the SIDFX expansion. You make sure that the area around it is prepared, install it in place, and then you connect up a few different bits and pieces to different pins on a couple of different spots on the IC. Now, this was the bit that I was concerned about most, because I don't really like fiddling about with the pins on older bits of equipment like this, especially not pins on IC chips that are impossible to get nowadays. But as it turns out, it was much more straightforward than I thought it would be. The way it works is you get these kind of wee plasticky grabber things that when you pull them back, these wires come out, and then you let them grip onto the pins. You don't have to do any kind of soldering. It's way easier than it looks in the video or in the manuals or anything like that. You just have to be extra careful to make sure that you're connecting them to the correct pins. And so I did check that about 6 times before I turned the Commodore back on. But that's kind of just the extent of the build. Perhaps the most kind of scary thing about all of that is you have to drill holes in the case itself. There's 2 switches and 1 stereo mini audio jack, and to me there's something almost criminal about drilling into a case of such a revered and vintage instrument. But Given that I've drilled into many cases at this point and destroyed many things, I've at least got a wee bit of experience and knowledge about how to avoid the worst disasters. So I drilled the holes and everything seems to be fine and lined up and doesn't look too terrible, which is nice. Now at first when I turned on my Commodore 64, I did get a wee bit of a fright because the screen was all garbled and I thought I had completely messed something up with the installation. I did contact SIDFX themselves and they were extremely quick to reply and very helpful, so they have to get credit for that. As it turns out, I don't think the SIDFX installation had anything to do with the screen problems. I think this was an issue that was already there because it seems to be something to do with the actual visual part of the Commodore 64 rather than anything that's connected to the SIDFX. So that's not great, but it's something that at least I can work around for now and just use the SID as intended. One of the features of the SIDFX which I like a lot is the fact that using one of those switches that I showed you earlier, you can go between having either one, the other, or both of the installed SID chips active at any one time. And because you can do that without having to restart the computer every time, it means that if you're using something like SynthCart, which I've got up on the screen here, you can go through presets and just switch between the two different SIDs and get a really clear idea of how they sound and where they differ. So that's what I'm going to do just now. I'm going to flick between the different settings on the switch and let you hear how they sound just one on at a time, but also how they sound together, because there is quite a big difference. And I should say up front that this obviously is not going to be a strict scientific comparison, because I'm not 100% sure that the SID chips that I've got in there are actually 100% working and in fully perfect order or whatever. But to be honest, I'm getting the kind of main differences and characteristics that I would expect from the SIDs, and I'm not really noticing any major flaws outside the ones that are inherent in the design. And to be honest, at the end of the day, I don't really give a fuck what the reason for the difference in the sounds in there is. What I'm interested in is the fact that I'm getting some interesting sounds and I've got a bit of variety and it's reproducible. So with that kind of caveat, we'll go ahead. And what I'll do is I'll basically play through some of these presets, let you hear how they sound together, how they sound on the 8580 chip, and then how they sound on the 6581 chip. There's a couple of things you might notice straight away. The first one is that the 8580 chip is noticeably louder. I've tried to compensate a wee bit for that within the kind of recorder I'm using, but there's no way to kind of equalize it out completely. So when I switch between them, there is a noticeable volume difference there. And you should also note that the SID, which is the 6581, has quite a crackly filter. And I've tried a few different SID chips of that model, and they all kind of have this to a greater or worse degree. And I'm not entirely sure if that is a flaw in the chip design again, or whether it's just because these are older or whatever, but that's something to be aware of. So with that, I'll run through some of these presets. So you can hear there some of the differences between those presets depending on which SID you've got active, and it does make sense that those that rely more heavily on the filter for the sounds will sound quite different, or the most different, because the filter is the analog part of the SID chip after all. And to be honest, I quite like it. Some of those presets sound way better with one or the other SID active, and it's good to be able to have that kind of variety as far as I'm concerned, at least when it comes to making music with the thing. The more observant amongst you might have noticed there that I was playing more than one note at a time and wondering, well, what kind of polyphony do these SID chips have? And the answer is you can play 3 voices at once from a single SID chip. I'm not entirely sure if it's true polyphony, strictly speaking, since I believe they all go through the same filter, but either way you can play 3 notes at once. The logical question that follows on from that is, well, if you can play 3 notes at a time per SID chip, and you've got 2 SID chips in there, does that mean that you can play 6 notes at a time with 2 SID chips? And the answer is yes, yes you can. However, you can't just plug it in with SynthCart and get 6-note polyphony. You do have to do a wee bit of extra configuration for that to work. In the time it's taken me to record this video, I have ordered and received an SD card tape emulator, and this lets me run programs directly on the C64 from SD card rather than having to use a cassette tape deck, because I don't actually have one of them anymore. So this is very handy because it means I can now run the SIDFX configuration program, and in there's a whole variety of different options to set up your SIDs in different ways. Once you load up the config tool, this is the screen you're presented with, and it's quite nice because you get a whole bunch of information about what SID is in which slot and various other things. But you also have the physical position of the switch itself represented on the screen, which is really nice because it means that if you want to make a change to your preset, all you have to do is shift the actual physical switch itself and then modify the parameters associated with that switch position. Now, I won't bore you with all the parameters or all the details of what you can change in here, but there are a few specific things that are worth talking about. The first one is that you can either have your SIDs configured in a mono or stereo setup, and by mono all they mean is that both SIDs come out of both channels simultaneously, whereas with stereo you would have one SID in one ear and one SID in the other ear, so you basically have one SID in the left channel and one SID in the right channel. And this can be really handy if you want to split out the different SID sounds and mix them differently in post-processing, and that's how I've got mine configured. Now, one thing to note is that if you do have a stereo SID configuration, that it isn't necessarily as simple as just selecting stereo. You do also have to think about the address location of the SIDs, and this gets a wee bit complicated, but essentially different bits of software looks for the SID in different places, and this is where you can configure that. Now, you shouldn't have to worry about that too much, but if you do want to use all 6 voices within SynthCart, you will have to make a change physically to your modification internally, and that's because you can't access the address that you need within the configuration tool. You have to actually physically change things. So SynthCart needs to have the address of the second SID at DF00, and the only way to get to that is to change the pin from pin 7 to pin 10 using the grabber tool I showed you earlier. And within the configuration tool, it will still read DE00, but that way you will have access to all 6 voices. The problem with that, of course, because there's always a problem, is that then you run into compatibility issues with applications or software that need the SID to be at DE00, and one of them happens to be Messiah. One thing you can do, of course, is add in a switch so that it goes between address line 7 and address line 10 physically, and that way you don't have to keep opening up the Commodore 64, and I think I'll do that at some point. Once you've configured everything and you've come back in a SynthCart, you'll note there's some of the presets in here. I've got a polyphonic mode, but you actually need to turn on the 6-channel mode specifically to get the 6 voices. And to do that, you hit Control and Return on the keyboard, and that lets you use all 6 of the voices. So we'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wonderful. You'll note the first 3 voices don't appear on the visualizer. I don't really know why that is. It is a wee bit of a shame, but hey, at least you can hear them. Now, the other thing you might be wondering with this is, how does it allocate the voices? Does it use up all of the voices on one chip and then go on to the other one? Well, no, it alternates. So one SID chip plays the first note, the next one plays the next note, and it kind of cycles them that way. So that's part 2 of my Commodore 64 synthesizer project done. I have to say that I thought that would be much harder than it was, and installing the SIDFX in particular was very straightforward. So I would recommend it if you're thinking about doing the same kind of thing to your own device, as opposed to some of the other options that are out there. The next thing I'm going to have to do, or that I want to do, I guess, with this project is to build the Look Mum No Computer MIDI interface controller thing that lets me quickly adjust parameters within SynthCart without having to use some kind of key commands and stuff on the Commodore 64 itself. And I'm not entirely sure how easy that will be, but I guess we'll see. So for now, I'm going to enjoy my glorious stereo SID goodness, and I will speak to you next time.